Welcome to the Explainer. You've probably seen the headlines about the US tariffs on India, right? Well, what if that's not the real story? Today we're going to dig into a really interesting perspective that says the tariffs are just a smokescreen for a much bigger global power play.
So, the author we're looking at, Rajiv Srinivasan, kicks things off with this killer quote from Macbeth. His point? Yeah, the tariffs are dramatic, they're full of sound and fury, but they might not actually mean anything. They're not the main event.
So that really begs the question, doesn't it? If these tariffs are just noise, what's the signal? What are we supposed to be focusing on? All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so first up, let's try to understand the author's take on the tariffs themselves. He says you can't look at them as some permanent policy. Instead, you gotta see them for what they are, a classic opening move in a really high-stakes negotiation.
The argument here is that this is classic Trump negotiating style. You start with a totally maximalist position, something really extreme, just to set the stage for a deal later on. It's basically down and dirty boardroom tactics applied to global trade. And the author's advice is pretty straightforward. Don't get rattled, just expect them to back down later.
Okay, so if the tariffs are a negotiating tactic, what's the real game? Well, this is where we get to the heart of the whole argument. We're about to zoom out and look at a much bigger story about global power, one that's been playing out for decades.
So what's the one thing driving this whole conflict? It's the U.S. trade deficit with China. I mean, look at these numbers. It didn't just grow, it exploded. From just $6 million back in '85 to a mind-boggling $386 billion by 2022. According to our source, this isn't just a number, it's the entire backdrop for everything we're seeing today.
And this situation has created something the author calls the anti-Thucydides trap. Now, you might have heard of the Thucydides trap. It's this idea that when a rising power challenges a ruling one, conflict is almost inevitable. But what's happening here is the opposite. The argument is that the ruling power, the US, has actually spent decades helping its biggest challenger, China, to rise.
So how on earth did this happen? Well, it boils down to one word: leverage. The source material argues that China played its cards perfectly. It offered the world the China price, cost so low nobody could resist. And by doing that, it became the world's factory, building up a supply chain so massive that it now has a monopoly on all sorts of critical materials, like rare earths.
And this leads to a pretty provocative theory. The author floats the idea of a G2 condominium. The concept is kind of wild. It's a future where the US and China basically make a quiet deal to carve up the world between them, creating their own spheres of influence, kind of like Spain and Portugal did centuries ago.
Okay, so if the real beef is with China, why is India getting hit with tariffs? This is where the author uses a really vivid analogy to explain the thinking behind it.
He uses a Malayalam proverb that basically translates to, humiliated in the marketplace, you come home and take it out on your mother. And that nails the dynamic, right? The idea is that the US, feeling outplayed and frustrated by China on the world stage, is coming home and lashing out at someone it thinks won't fight back as hard, its friends and allies.
And this frustration isn't coming from nowhere. The analysis points to the US being backed into a corner by China's economic leverage, maybe feeling ignored by rivals like Russia. So what happens? That pressure needs an outlet, and allies like India, the EU, and Japan end up taking the heat.
But here's where things get really interesting. We're pivoting now from just diagnosing the problem to looking at the solution. Because the author doesn't just point out what's wrong, he lays out a whole strategic roadmap for how India can actually come out of this stronger.
Drawing on his background in business strategy, the author says that nations are a lot like companies. At the end of the day, there are only three ways to really win. You can be the cost leader, you can have the best customer relationships, or you can be the top innovator. Price, people, or product, basically.
So if we apply that framework to the two big players right now, you see a pretty clear split. The argument is that the US's main advantage, its real strength, is innovation. Meanwhile, China has just absolutely dominated the game as the world's cost leader, no question.
So, where does India fit in all this? Well, this is the key point. The analysis suggests India has this unique opportunity to compete on all three fronts. It can leverage its huge market and culture of frugal innovation to compete on cost. It can use its understanding of similar markets in places like Africa and Southeast Asia to build customer intimacy, and it can push its incredible tech sector to move from services to creating world-beating products.
And now for the twist. The author points to a huge, maybe even accidental, opportunity for India. And it comes from a place you probably wouldn't expect, a quirk in US domestic policy.
Yeah, 250,000. That's the estimated number of brilliant Indian software engineers in the U.S. right now on temporary H-1B visas. And many of them are stuck in what they call green card limbo, with basically no clear path to staying permanently.
And this is where the comparison is just fascinating. China literally spent billions creating a program to bring its best and brightest talent back home. But the author's point is that the US might just give India its talent back for free by making it too hard for them to stay. He calls this the Idi Amin syndrome, a really provocative term, referencing that moment in history when a country expelled its most skilled people, accidentally creating a windfall for others.
So you see how this all comes together? It's all building to what the author sees as a massive turning point for India, a moment where a crisis can be flipped into a defining opportunity. He tells this great old story about a court poet to make the point. You know, a full moon is beautiful, but it's at its peak. It has nowhere to go but to get smaller, to wane. But a new moon is just starting its journey. It's waxing. And in this story, India is that waxing new moon.
And he draws a parallel to the 1991 economic crisis in India, a moment that forced huge positive reforms. But he points out one critical difference. Back in '91, that opportunity was kind of stumbled into by accident. This time, he says, it's an opportunity that can be seized on purpose by design with a real strategy.
So let's just wrap up the key takeaways here. First, the tariffs, they're a distraction. The real story is the huge geopolitical game between the US and China. India is kind of the collateral damage in all this, but, and this is the big but, this crisis is a massive opportunity for India to build real long-term strength, especially with that potential talent windfall from the US.
So in the end, the author doesn't give us a neat prediction. He leaves us with a challenge. He basically says, this is your game to win or lose, India. It's a powerful final thought, because it puts the focus squarely on strategy and action, not fate.